Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Questions for Mr. Krebs, but before I get to that, I just want to be clear. We've heard a number of statements made by other witnesses. We've heard those statements before. We're continuing to hear those statements. And I would just say, anybody who's watching this hearing, look at the 60 court cases that have been brought before the judiciary in this country and how the arguments, or I should say the statements, they're not really arguments, they're statements that have been made, have all been rejected by courts of law, including in Wisconsin, which was a Republican judge that rejected the arguments made by this administration. So just take a look at all this that we're putting into the record. Mr. Krebs, CISA has the primary responsibility for working with state and local election officials and the private sector to secure our election infrastructure. I think it's important for folks to realize where you sat and what your responsibilities. And in essence, you were tasked with coordinating with thousands of your partners across the country to ensure the integrity of the 2020 election. That was your job. And by all accounts, you were very successful at that. President Trump's own Department of Justice concluded, and I'm going to quote the Department of Justice in the Trump administration, "We have not seen fraud on a scale that could have affected a different outcome in the election," end of quote. The Election Infrastructure Government Coordinating Council, Executive Committee, and the Election Infrastructure Sector Coordinating Council, comprising of federal, state, and local government officials and numerous private sector organizations from all around the country, jointly called this, quote, "the most secure in American history," end of quote. You also echoed this statement, and when you echoed that statement, you were fired by President Trump. He didn't want to hear that, clearly. So my question to you, do you stand by that statement? Have you seen anything in the week since November 4th that would lead you to change your mind? And have you identified any credible claim of widespread election irregularities?
I stand by the claim. I said it in my opening statement. It's in my written testimony. I'm yet to see anything from a security perspective that would change my opinion on that. Fraud is a different matter. It's a criminal matter. But again, bolstered by the Attorney General's statement from last week or recently, again, nothing to change my opinion of that matter.
So yet despite this, after more than 5 weeks now that the president has lost, and numerous public officials have continued to pressure state and local elected officials to push what are demonstrably false narrative that election irregularities should somehow make him a winner in this race. You have willingly, in fact, these folks are willingly fanning the flames of discontent, and they're in the process of weakening institutions that are essential for our representative democracy. My question to you is, what is the danger, in your estimation, to the democratic process to challenge the legitimacy of an election and deny its results in the absence of any credible evidence?
So I think generally from a timing perspective, particularly with the seating of the Electoral College and 306 electoral votes for President-elect Biden, you know, I think we're past the point where we need to be having conversations about the outcome of this election. I think that continued assaults on democracy and the outcome of this election that only serves to undermine confidence in the process is ultimately, as you both have said, you know, ultimately corrosive to the institutions that support elections. And going forward, it will be that much harder. The trick about elections is that, you know, you're not so much trying to convince the winner they won, it's the loser that they lost. And you need willing participants on both sides. And I think we've got to get back to that point. Otherwise, we're going to have a very difficult time going forward maintaining confidence in this American experiment.
During the 2016 election, we saw foreign disinformation campaigns trying to sow doubt about the integrity of our election. We've seen that before, and very clearly in 2016, and certainly all the intelligence community in this country backed that up. And so, in fact, CISA's rumor control page was actually created within your agency. You mentioned it in your testimony to address foreign disinformation having an impact on the election. Yet rather than creating fake news, it seems as if Russia has simply used state-controlled news outlets to basically push President Trump's own statements and lies about a rigged election. Our adversaries don't don't have to be technologically advanced. Our adversaries don't have to be creative to sow that doubt. All they have to do is air the words of American elected officials on their state-owned news networks. As Clint Watts said, he's a former FBI agent and a disinformation expert, put it, which I think is very strong, and he said, quote, "Nothing that Russia or Iran or China could say is anywhere near as wild as what the president is saying," end of quote. So my question is, how are our foreign adversaries taking advantage of false claims of broad election fraud by the president and his supporters, or hearings, like we're hearing here, we're hearing these statements again, that are broadly claiming systemic irregularities where none exist? How damaging is that?
So talking about rumor control very briefly, I think that that was an innovation in government that we created on the fly to address some emerging threats. The point, though, that I'd like to highlight with rumor control is that it was intended to identify and debunk issues as they were emerging. And we saw domestic disinformation campaigns of a cybersecurity nature that were emerging in the days and weeks following the election. I'll specifically talk about the hammer and scorecard claims that there was a CIA supercomputer and program that were flipping votes throughout the country, in Georgia specifically. But again, Chairman Johnson, I'm going to keep coming back to it. That's why it's so important to have a paper trail. That's why it's so important to have paper ballots. So even if there was foreign interference of a malicious algorithm nature, you can always go back to the receipts. You can check your math. And Georgia did that 3 times, and the outcomes were consistent over and over and over again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.